Welcome back. As I was mentioning at the end of the last lecture, Congress does most of its work in committees. And so in this mini lecture, I want to talk about Congress and committees. And keep in mind something that I said at the end of the very last lecture, and that is that Congress is organized on a partisan basis, that it is important to be the majority party, not just because you have more votes and you're more likely to get your legislation passed, but keep in mind that the chairperson of every committee is going to come from the majority party. If I ask a question on the exam, I think there is a question that I'm going to ask that says currently, you should know that the Democrats are the majority party in the House of Representatives and the Republicans are currently the majority party in the Senate, which means that the Democrats have a majority on every committee in the House. They chair every committee in the House, and it means that in the Senate, the Republicans chair every committee, and they have a majority on every committee. I want to talk about three different types of committees. Your book talks about, I believe, five of them. There are only three of them that are going to appear on the exam. The first, and probably structurally the most important, are the standing committees. The standing committees are the basic working units of Congress. If I ask about them, underline the fact that they are permanent. They are ongoing committees that deal with broad policy areas. So the name of the committee is going to tell you what they deal with. So, for example, the Agricultural Committee deals with agriculture, the Education Committee with education, the Foreign Relations Committee with foreign relations, the Judiciary Committee that I talked about when I talked about the Supreme Court deals with the courts, etc. As you might imagine, congresspersons try to get on committees that are going to be of use to their constituents. So, for example, in the Merced area, in the Turlock area, you see people wanting to get on, say, the Agricultural Committee. Now, many of these committees are broken down into subcommittees, and you should know that do a great deal of the work on legislation. So, for example, the Agricultural Committee is broken down into 6 subcommittees. One of them is dairy. So, as you might imagine, again, given the Turlock to Merced area where I live and where I work, a dairy subcommittee would be a useful committee for me if I were a congressperson and I were representing the area actually almost anywhere in the Central Valley. I do believe that I asked a question on the exam that says typically the chairpersons of these committees are what, or I may have asked the question typically what is the most important criteria for the selection of committee chairs, and you should know that typically committee chairs are selected based on the seniority system. Seniority. Remember, the seniority system merely implies that a person attains this position of chair on the basis of length of service on that committee. So there are three potential questions about standing committees. You should know they're permanent, they're ongoing, they deal with broad policy areas. Typically, the committee chairs are based on seniority, and you should know that the vast majority of committees are broken down into subcommittees that do a great deal of the work on legislation. And just to illustrate what I mean by doing a great deal of the work on legislation, this might mean, for example, holding hearings. And let me just give you a what if. Let's say that we have a bill being proposed in Congress to change the price supports for milk. That would be parceled out to the Agricultural Committee. The Agricultural Committee would then send that bill to the Dairy Subcommittee. The Dairy Subcommittee would then hold hearings. They would have lobbyists on behalf of dairy farmers, for example. There probably would be people testifying what the change in the price supports of milk, how this might affect consumers. how costly this program is. Is this a program that is worth investing in from a financial perspective? There could be a variety of other interested parties and experts who may speak on behalf of a change in the price supports and people who may speak against it. That subcommittee would then engage in a markup of the bill. Your textbook talks about that. They would write a rough draft. They might propose some amendments and a draft for the Agricultural Committee to consider. The Agricultural Committee then would take the bill, probably amend it some more. If there was great controversy, they might send it even back to the subcommittee. But the subcommittee is the one that's going to do a lot of the investigative work. Again, remember, think about committees and subcommittees as islands of specialization. So agriculture is an island of specialization. Obviously, dairy would be even more specialized than that. So for standing committees, know they're permanent. Know that committee chairs are based typically, there's rare exception, but not very many, on seniority, and that most committees are broken down into subcommittees that do a great deal of the legislative work on a bill. The second committee that I have in your notes is a conference committee. And keep in mind something here. Nearly every important bill that gets passed in Congress is passed in differing forms by the House and the Senate. Remember that for a bill to become law, it has to be passed in identical form in both the House and the Senate. And so if a bill is passed in the House and the Senate, but they are not passed in identical form, then a conference committee is going to have to be formed. What you should know when I ask the question on the exam about conference committees is that these are temporary committees that are designed to reconcile conflicting versions of a bill. Your book makes a couple of excellent observations that I usually forget in lecture. And last semester I forgot both of these points, so I'm glad that before I put these mini lectures together, I reread the book because I would have forgot both of them again. First of all is something I have mentioned, and this one maybe I would have remembered. I've talked about how there has been increased partisanship in recent years, but one of the things that I forgot about that is that that has meant that fewer bills have gotten through the House and the Senate, and as a result, conference committees have been used less and less. A conference committee usually is going to have members from the standing committee. So in this case, if we're dealing with a bill for price supports for milk, which was my illustration, we would have members from either the Agricultural Committee, which would be most likely. Possibly they might throw someone in with real expertise on dairy to act as a spokesperson for the subcommittee. They then will try to iron out a compromise, and if they do, that bill then gets resubmitted to the House and the Senate, and they have to vote up or down on the bill. They can no longer offer amendments to it. For exam purposes, realize that the job of a conference committee is to try to get a bill into identical form in both the House and the Senate. The third committee that I have listed in your notes is the Rules Committee. First of all, just a reminder, the Rules Committee only exists in the House of Representatives. There is no Rules Committee in the Senate. And the Rules Committee is what gives the Speaker of the House so much more institutional power than the Majority Leader of the Senate, because the Rules Committee assigns the terms of debate for all legislation that goes to the full House. The Speaker has a stranglehold on the Rules Committee because it is the Speaker that determines the membership. So unlike other committees, the Speaker appoints all members to the Rules Committee, and so many people have argued in scholarly articles and in textbooks that I've used that the Rules Committee can be seen as a structural and organizational extension of the Speaker's power. The Rules Committee determines whether amendments are going to be allowed on a bill. The Rules Committee determines how much time will be allowed for discussion. The Rules Committee can delay or even prevent legislation from moving forward. So it is incredibly powerful, and of course, this allows the Speaker to get their legislation through. Now, contrast this with the Senate. In the Senate, the majority leader does not have nearly as much power. And add this to the notes. This is important. This is something, I don't know if it's an exam question or not, but certainly I think it is one of the really significant points from the chapter. Greenberg and Page, your textbook authors, claim that currently, and I think they are correct, currently garnering 60 votes to end debate to prevent a filibuster is the biggest obstacle to passing legislation in the Senate. It is true, as they point out, that once debate ends in the Senate, you only need 51 votes to pass legislation, which is a simple majority. However, the minority party has a very powerful weapon. Put multiple stars next to this notion of a filibuster. A filibuster is a delay tactic to prevent a vote on legislation. And stopping a filibuster is relatively difficult because it requires 3/5 of the Senate or 60 votes. That is very, very difficult. What that means is that unless the majority party has 60 senators, and it has been a while since the majority party has had 60 votes in the Senate, the minority party can basically prevent a bill in its tracks by threatening a filibuster. Your book even talks about something that I won't test you on, but I will point out this notion of what's called a Senate hold, H-O-L-D, a hold. And this is a tactic, and we saw this not too long ago, a tactic where a single senator can prevent action on a bill by threatening to block agreement on unanimous consent. And your book talks about how increasingly single solitary senators are preventing votes on legislation through holds and through threatening filibusters. So this makes legislation much more difficult to pass in the Senate. It really prevents the leadership from moving bills forward often. There has been some discussion about ending a filibuster. I never thought that I would say this, but given the dysfunction that has occurred in Washington, D.C. over the last 10 years or so, it may be time to end the filibuster. Now, obviously, even if the filibuster were ended, there still is this big problem that often we have divided government in Washington, D.C. Historically, if you look back in time, usually one political party was the dominant political party for a long, long time with only very short interruptions. One party controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate, and they could get things done. In the last 50 years, the norm has been what we have today, where one party, the Republicans, control the presidency and the Senate, the Democrats control the House. There have been Democratic administrations where Barack Obama, a Democrat, was president, and you had Republicans controlling either the House or the Senate. When people talk about ending the filibuster, they make an assumption that that would end gridlock in Washington. The filibuster is one mode of obstruction, but it is not the only one. Divided government is one, the Senate holds are one. So you should know what a filibuster is, and you should know what a cloture vote is, ending a filibuster.